What we should avoid is a role that was designed for a doctor being substituted by a PA. It's that old saying, you don't know what you don't know. And because the training is limited, there are diagnoses that might be missed.
Do you think this is potentially something that physician associates are going to be unhappy with?
It is potentially one of the things they will be unhappy with. We need more staff in the NHS. These are people who are well-trained, committed members of the workforce. But what we do need to do is to have that clarity around how they work.
This sounds like a monumental failure of workforce planning.
There was nothing in the evidence base that said these two professions are so unsafe that we have to completely abandon them. But equally, there was nothing at the other end of the spectrum that says this is all fine. Some PAs said, look, I never wanted to be a doctor. I didn't want to be so disrupted in my personal life. I didn't want to have that uncertainty about my training.
I guess there might still be trouble ahead in that case.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Hello, welcome. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Gillian Leng, who is author of the Leng Review into physician associates and anaesthesia associates. It's a much awaited review. People are very much excited to hear the findings, and it's a tremendous piece of work. So Jill, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you, Kamran.
On producing your report. It is very clear.
Good.
And very, very thorough. I mean, tell us in your own words how you went about it and what did you find?
Okay, well, I wanted it to be based on the best available evidence. You know that I spent 20 years working at NICE, so you won't be surprised at that. So I wanted us to be comprehensive in looking at that evidence base, and that's partly about research, published research, but also as much data in relation to safety that we could get hold of, and as informed as it could be by engagement with all the relevant groups. So the physician associates, anaesthesia associates themselves, with the doctors, with patients and their families and managers. So very, very comprehensive. I think that's the most important thing to emphasise. And then I had to sit down and look at all that information and work out what is a logical way forwards.
Yeah. But just let's stick to the methods a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, tell us a little bit about the evidence that you looked at and you examined.
Okay. Well, in terms of the published research evidence, it was sadly not as helpful as it might have been. It didn't provide a definitive answer. So it was limited in terms of the quality, and in terms of most quality classifications that you'd use, it was either low or very low quality. So that wasn't brilliant. It was limited in terms of the scope that it covered. So, for instance, the evidence base in secondary care, there was nothing for anaesthesia associates. In terms of physician associates, what there was limited to the emergency department. So it was limited in the scope, and it was generally inconsistent. So it wasn't possible to say, right, the evidence says this, so we're going to do this.
Yeah.
It was an important piece of work to have done, but it had to then be triangulated with professional opinion, with patient feedback, with workforce requirements. I couldn't just rely on that evidence base.
Yeah. So what were the lessons that you drew from the evidence base then?
Well, it was clear that there was nothing in the evidence base that said these two professions are so unsafe that we have to completely abandon them. There's nothing there that says they're so unsafe we really shouldn't have them at all. But equally, there was nothing at the other end of the spectrum that says this is all fine. We can be 100% confident that these roles are safe and therefore we should carry on unchanged. So that was the most important thing I think that I could draw, those two ends of the spectrum. But what that did mean was that we needed to particularly clarify how the roles were going to work moving forwards, because there was all sorts of feedback, confusion, concern from both patients, professional groups, from managers. So a whole set of issues that needed to be clarified. But that sadly was the limitation of the evidence, the published research evidence. I mean, I also asked for data on safety. So we got some data from the Care Quality Commission, which was helpful, but again limited because it's not designed to be looked at by professional group.
Okay.
You'll know, we don't collect safety data to point fingers at people.
No.
We have it there to look for system errors.
Yeah.
But equally, it doesn't help us to say whether there's a particular professional group that is having more challenges, shall we say, around safety than others. There was some useful audit data that the anaesthesia community sent through, but again, limited in number, limited in the scope.
Okay. So, I mean, the situation is this: back when you were commissioned around October, November time of last year by West Streeting, I think that was a good move considering all the toxicity around this particular issue. So, and you talk about the toxic environment in your report as well, which I think captures the way things were and still are to some degree. And then you're faced with having an evidence base that actually doesn't really help you in moving things forward. You framed your question specifically around those two scenarios, didn't you, that you just described there, which is, should we continue on our current trajectory or should we stop altogether? And if not, what is the kind of middle path? Or not necessarily middle path, but where do those kind of two extremes meet and allow us to move forward?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The core question, the core remit I was given was around safety and effectiveness of PAs and AAs as part of a multidisciplinary team. But within that, I felt it was important to look at the two extremes. Are we so sure that they're unsafe that we stop the roles or we carry on as we are? Because those are the sorts of questions that some people have been asking. So I felt I needed to be explicit that I had looked at those scenarios.
Yeah. So we had the evidence base, we had the data. You also surveyed professionals. Tell us about how you went about that and what that showed you.
Okay. We produced a survey designed for physician associates themselves and for anaesthesia associates and those that work with them, because I thought we'd get a better perspective from people that actually are currently working with those groups or have recently, rather than all of the professional groups. There have been other surveys that I also looked at of the medical profession in general, what do you think of these groups? But the survey for this review was focused on PAs, AAs, and those that work with them. There's a full report that will be available when the main report is published.
Okay.
If people are really interested in the detail, but just to pull out a couple of things that were particularly striking. One was about confidence in the roles from doctors. And it's clear that if you're actually somebody that is working with a PA or an AA, you by and large have much more confidence in those roles than if you haven't worked with them for a while. So that direct experience is interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And the other thing that we found in the survey, which again others have also found, is that the expectation of what roles are appropriate are quite different between doctors and PAs and AAs. So PAs and AAs have high expectation of all sorts of things that they might do, whereas doctors have much lower expectations. And the reason for that isn't entirely clear, but there is a difference.
Yeah. And can you give us a couple of examples of the things that doctors and PAs agree on and a couple that they don't agree on?
Yeah. So for in relation to the roles that PAs might undertake, things like carrying out audit and research, prevention, carrying out immunisation programs, there's much more agreement that those are appropriate roles. Whereas seeing undifferentiated patients and making diagnoses, there's more difference in whether in the two groups there.
Okay, well, we'll come back to particularly the point about undifferentiated patients a little later. And then the third strand of your sort of triangulation was stakeholder interviews and stakeholder group sessions.
Yes. So a core group of stakeholders that included all the interested parties. So the GMC, the CQC, the BMA, medical royal colleges. We met several times round a table, worked through the methods in particular. Just to be clear, that group did not inform the recommendations, but they did help in terms of how we gathered information. So,
Yeah.
and I also spoke to the relatives of the small number of people who sadly died where the role of the PA was implicated in the coroner's report. I thought it was important to hear their perspectives.
Yeah.
And those families were clearly concerned that they hadn't understood that the role of a physician associate was not the same as a doctor. And
yeah, that's one of the recommendations, which let's move on to them then.
Yeah.
So that you triangulated from those sources, and then you've come up with a set of recommendations. Can you walk us through those? What are the key ones?
Right. The recommendations are all designed to provide clarity, because you talked about this being a toxic debate. We could call it toxic, we could call it conflict, we could call it confusion. What we need moving forwards is clarity. So let me try and put these recommendations into three groups, three buckets. And the first is around clarity of recognition of the roles, which picks up on what I was just talking about, relatives. So that includes changing the name from associates to physician assistants and to physician assistants in anaesthesia. The relatives that I spoke to felt that would have been important in terms of clarifying the role. Many of the doctors that I spoke to would also welcome that name change, and it's also consistent with the name that's used internationally. So a number of reasons, not least the positioning of the role, as to why it explains why I made that recommendation.
Yeah. So how did the physician associates feel about that? Did you consult the PAs about the name change?
I didn't consult them specifically. I had numerous conversations with PAs and AAs, as you might imagine, but I didn't specifically consult them about the name change, no.
I guess it was similar with doctors. I mean, did you go to them and say, we're thinking of changing the name? Or this is something that emerged because of as a result of your conversations?
It emerged as a result of my conversations, and the particular driver for the name change was the patient voice. It has to be said, it was the patient voice. And I haven't consulted with anybody on the recommendations. The recommendations are informed by a broad set of feedback and engagement, but they are my recommendations and not developed as part of a consultation approach.
Okay. Do you think this is potentially something that physician associates are going to be unhappy with?
It is potentially one of the things they will be unhappy with.
Yeah. How did that name come about? Can you tell me? Because I think they were called physician assistants in the beginning.
Yeah, they were originally called physician assistants in the beginning, and I think the name changed in the around about 2014, and I think physician assistants, as they were then, were keen on that name change. They felt it would provide a greater sense of perhaps autonomy in the role, and it was felt it would help in terms of them becoming a regulated profession.
Yeah.
However, the assistant name is used internationally.
Sure.
And I am not making the name change with an expectation that regulation will change. I don't think it does alter the need for regulation of that group.
Okay.
I just think it's going to help position them for patients.
Yeah, because I think people do talk of being confused over the name. Did you get that message from the patients that you spoke with?
Absolutely, clearly.
Yeah.
They were very keen that the word assistant was used rather than associate, because associate to the patients that I spoke to sounded like it was a grand title, we say.
Okay. Right. So that's a big change.
Yeah.
What else have you recommended?
Easier recognition of the PA and AA role. But that's also in the context that we have more types of healthcare role in the NHS than, I'm told, anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So it is quite difficult to recognise who you're seeing.
That's quite a fact, though. We have more roles than anywhere else. It's in your report. I read it,
Yeah, it is quite a fact.
Yeah.
So I think it should... I've recommended that it's easier to identify who you see when you go into a GP surgery or whether you go into a hospital through a combination of name badge, lanyards perhaps with dietitian or physician associate around them, with uniforms, ideally at a national level, because even the most seasoned of us in terms of our experience of healthcare do find it confusing. You go into different hospitals, they have different uniforms, and I actually think it matters. It's part of that safety profile. You know who you're seeing, you know what to expect, and you understand what their role is.
Yeah, but that would mean all other allied health professionals would also, or
Yeah.
associates or assistants would have to have some kind of dress in that sense. If everybody wears blues, surgical blues, then
Yes,
it's hard
yes,
to
yes,
distinguish.
it's hard to distinguish.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I haven't gone into the detail of,
Oh, where
of
was
what those
that?
colours should be, I have to say.
Yeah.
But I think consistency and clarity and identification across the NHS would make it safer, and it would make it easier for patients to navigate, especially bearing in mind the number of roles that we have.
Okay, and clarity, as you say, ties in with
Yeah.
safety, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
also people coming away from a consultation think really understanding what's happened to
Yeah.
them, which is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Where else?
And just a final thing on that
Yeah.
identification, I think information that's clearly displayed, perhaps in a GP surgery or on a hospital ward, that where you often see photographs of the staff, but with that photograph, let's just have the name, the role, and a sentence around what that person does.
Yeah.
Basic information.
Yeah.
Healthcare is complicated these days.
Yeah.
There's so much that can be done, so many different treatments. And I think we need to help the patients and patients' relatives as they walk through that.
Okay. So that's around being clear about role
Yeah.
and identifying people. Which category would you like to move on to
I'd
now?
then like to move on to clarity around how the roles work in relation to doctors. And I'm describing that as a complementary role, avoiding conflict and avoiding confusion. There's clearly been some great examples of where that happens already, where you do see PAs working in a complementary way to doctors. However, there has been some substitution where PAs are working in doctors' roles, albeit with supervision.
Yeah.
So I've recommended a number of things. The first is template standard job descriptions for the first roles that PAs and AAs do when they're in secondary care and in primary care, because that scopes out for everyone the avoidance of doubt what those roles are about at the start of their careers.
Yeah.
And I think that is more straightforward than writing out a scope of practice, because it's a practical tool that the system can use. Within that, though, there's an important caveat that PAs should not see undifferentiated patients unless they've been triaged into adult patients with minor ailments, and that's in line with the advice that the College of General Practitioners put out a while ago. So I think that's important, because diagnosis is where there's the biggest safety risk.
Okay. Can I just unpick that a little?
Yeah.
Which is that, who's going to draft those templates?
I have.
Oh, you have? Why, you saved over the effort. Well done. Okay.
Well,
Right.
not. I drafted those template job descriptions.
Oh, okay.
They are in the appendix of the report.
All right. Okay.
There has been input from the colleges that also worked on scopes of practice to make sure that they are appropriately positioned. But they are there, and I think that's an important
All right,
resource.
so you've saved everybody a job.
I hope so.
Yeah.
If you save people jobs, you usually get better implementation because it's easy.
Yeah, so I didn't get that far in the appendices.
Caught you out, Kamran.
Yeah, you did, yeah. Okay, well, we'll run that still, don't worry. And then, but in your report, which I have read, you say that physician assistants, as they will be called, should spend their first 2 years in hospital.
Yes.
And not go directly into primary care. Talk to me about that. That sounds a bit more like standard GP training, because in the traditional, where I'm not saying physician assistants are being trained to be GPs, but you spend a couple of years in hospital and then you go into primary care generally.
Yeah. I heard quite a few concerns that it was that the training that PAs receive is limited. It's clearly more limited than you would have for a doctor.
Yeah.
Therefore, to say you can go straight from that training to work in primary care or indeed to work in a mental health trust didn't seem logical. And providing that 2 years to have a greater grounding in a clinical environment where you've got support around you helps provide confidence. It will provide confidence when those PAs eventually move into primary care, that they've had that broader training.
Yeah. And then that comes back to I think it's another kind of, major recommendation, which is about undifferentiated patients. Explain that a little bit more for people who might not be familiar with the issues.
Okay. Physician associates can do a broad range of things, and they're very good at taking histories, they're trained in the art of examination. But the biggest concerns that I heard was about diagnosis, because it's that old saying, you don't know what you don't know. And because the training is limited, so, if it's this rather than this, there are diagnoses that might be missed. And that's what everyone agreed on, that was where the risk was. So even with careful supervision, you are still at risk.
Yeah.
So the safer way forward is to say PAs don't see patients when they first come in with no diagnosis, unless they have been carefully triaged and it's clearly about an adult patient with a minor ailment. There is, I'm absolutely sure, more work that needs to be done around how this is going to work in practice. So the report also recommends that there needs to be some more work to put in place clinical protocols, national clinical protocols, because as PAs develop, they will gain more skills, they'll do more courses. That framing around adult patients with minor ailments might be too limited, but to move forward from that, we need those careful national protocols and we need clear training.
Yeah.
That's the starting position here and now in my report.
Okay. And I think people will be doctors will be very relieved to hear that. Yeah. But still, at the end of that, there is the possibility, though, that some PAs will see undifferentiated patients, which leaves a bit of an unknown, doesn't it? Or are you going to make that very clear and explicit as to what PAs will be able to do?
So I've recommended that PAs should only see undifferentiated patients where they've already been triaged, where they are adult patients with minor ailments. However, there should also be some further work led by the medical Royal Colleges to define further the patients that might be seen by PAs in future, but only within the boundaries of what's set out in national clinical protocols.
Okay. Can I just clarify one thing, terminology-wise, with you? To me, if someone's been triaged, they're not undifferentiated.
No, exactly. So they're not undifferentiated. They've been triaged. Yes, that is a fair challenge.
Okay. This is a perfect example of the sort of balancing act that the tightrope you're walking here, because on the one hand, there'll be some relief as in terms of this recommendation, but also if you're a PA, you're thinking, well, that's something that's been taken away from me.
It is a tightrope. It's a balance. However, there are many, many things, many roles that need to be undertaken across healthcare. And they're clearly a hugely valuable, flexible asset. So what I think we need to do is to determine the split of roles. So medicine is a spectrum from managing patients who are low risk because the diseases, conditions, whatever is being presented with are low risk, compared with more complex patients, higher risk. So let's think of that spectrum, and doctors with their broader training should manage the more complex end. And then with that triaging process, PAs can manage the lower risk, less complex end.
Yeah.
That does mean some change in the way we work. You can't simply substitute a doctor with a PA, because you need to think about how that patient flows so that you've got that split. How we We need to do some further work that's also recommended in the report to determine how we manage that, how we make multidisciplinary teams work effectively so that roles are carried out by people with the appropriate training to do those roles.
Okay. So, I mean, as part of that, of course, that requires oversight, and you have recommendations around oversight and supervision as well.
Yes. And in particular, I think each PA needs a senior doctor, a consultant, a GP, who is their named supervisor. That's the terminology that the GMC currently use. I might call it in management speak, I'd call that a line manager, but someone who has responsibility for making sure that a PA is working in a role for which they are appropriately trained. Because it's that movement of someone whose training doesn't allow them to do a particular role into, say, onto a resident doctor rota. That's where the risks occur.
Yeah, so you haven't got, you said substitution, doctors might call it replacement.
Yeah. So yes, that named supervisor is a really important part of ensuring safety and ensuring appropriateness of the roles being carried out by PAs.
Okay, can we just get a little bit more into the regulatory side of things? Because I'm trying to imagine the scenario. So in hospital, where all PAs are going to start their careers, doctors are responsible for a team of doctors. Nurses have their own teams, physiotherapists have their own teams, other staff have their own teams. But now you're going to add in a physician assistant into a team of doctors. They're going to be regulated both by the GMC, but the physician assistants will have their own professional college or body that sets standards for them. Is that how it's going to work? And how isn't that going to be tricky to manage?
I don't think it should be tricky to manage. I think there's a number of things to pick up based on what you've just asked.
Yeah.
And I think the important place to start is perhaps multidisciplinary teams. I think we should have multidisciplinary teams throughout the NHS. We need multidisciplinary teams, and we need doctors and others to be able to manage those multidisciplinary teams, and not just to think, I can only manage a team of doctors. Otherwise, it won't work.
Yeah, more like primary care.
Yeah, much more like primary care. That's a really helpful example. So I think we need multidisciplinary teams. In relation to the regulation by the GMC, it was out of scope of the review for me to look at whether that was the correct decision or not. However, we have other regulators. For instance, we have the Nursing and Midwifery Council that regulates nurses, midwives, nursing associates. And I think what I've recommended is the best way forwards around having a single regulator, which is to make it clearer and more distinct within the GMC regulation, that there's the regulation for doctors within good medical practice, and there's a separate virtual front door, if you like, that describes how regulation for PAs and PAAs in future is taken forwards. Rather than being all combined as one sees at the moment, there should be distinct routes that reinforces, supports the fact that PAs and PAAs are complementary to doctors.
Okay, I can see how you're attempting to make the situation clearer with your proposals, and as you say, essentially, you're doing what's pragmatic. But having said that, there remains a bone of contention in that the GMC, according to the BMA and to the anaesthetists, is meant to be regulating medical professionals. And they would argue that however you define physician associates or physician assistants, as they will be called now, that they are not medical professionals.
Yeah, I absolutely understand all of that conflict. And my recommendation was about let's make sure that the regulatory approach makes a distinction between those roles, makes it clear that they are distinct and complementary. But it was outside the scope of my review to look at whether or not the GMC was the right regulator. That wasn't within what I was asked to do.
Okay. Okay. I guess there might still be trouble ahead in that case.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, are there any other recommendations that you would like to highlight? 'Cause I see
Yes,
there
there's
are
a lot.
parallels between
Yeah.
physician assistants and physician
Yes, there
assistants in anaesthesia.
Yeah. I would just like to pick up on the ongoing training, and you mentioned a faculty.
Yeah.
So I think for physician assistants and for PAAs to develop in their career, they need to be able to have accredited training modules, accredited courses, and appropriate standards. And to do that, they need to have a faculty that they will relate to. And the bit that I think is really important is the input to those faculties, the oversight to those faculties from the medical royal colleges. Because if we want to make this work, if we want to have complementary roles, we need doctors to input and help shape that, or else we will end up with more conflict and confusion moving forwards. So I haven't set out an exact model of how that might work, but that's a piece of work for the next 6 months.
Is that different from the current faculty, or is it an evolution of what we have now?
We don't have a faculty anymore. There was a faculty set up, and it's no longer in place.
So it's not going to be
a gap at the moment.
Yeah.
There is a gap. Yeah.
What I mean is, I suppose we had one at the RCP. This is not going to. This is a reinvention of that in a different guise.
It might be similar to that. It needs to be worked through. I mean, if I'm honest, I think it should be something that sits under an umbrella across all the royal colleges, because we have the RCP, the College of Physicians, we have the College of General Practitioners, we have the College of Emergency Medicine, we have the College of Psychiatry, and PAs can work across all of those specialties. So ideally, we have a faculty that relates to all of those in some sort of umbrella arrangement, and that needs to be determined.
Okay. Can we just move? You talked about the role. A specific question around that. I mean, two of the specific issues that people were concerned about were PAs prescribing and also ordering ionizing radiation.
Yeah.
You've taken different views on different positions on those two. So prescribing is potentially open to PAs, whereas you've restricted any diagnostic tests to non-ionizing radiation. Now, when I look at the data which you've got in your report, in terms of what physician assistants want or feel confident doing, and in terms of what doctors feel that they are confident in doing, the numbers are quite similar, aren't they? So it's about sort of 50% of physician assistants think that their prescribing should be allowed, ordering ionizing radiation should be allowed, whereas a much lower proportion of doctors believe that physician assistants should be allowed to do both of those things. Yet you've taken a different stance on the two.
In relation to prescribing, there are an increasing number of professions that are now able to prescribe. So I'm sure you're aware that the new trainees in pharmacy trainees will all be able to prescribe in the future.
Yeah.
So the control that we once had of the medical profession over prescribing has changed.
Okay.
And I think that we shouldn't let physician associates prescribe too lightly.
Assistants,
yes. Assistants. Thank you for that correction, Kamran. Physician assistants prescribe too lightly. However, to say never in the context of the multi-professional workforce that we have with other professions able to prescribe, it feels that with appropriate training to create a permanent bar is unrealistic. So that is only in the context of appropriate training, career path, where both medical royal colleges have have confidence
Yeah.
in the training module,
Yeah.
and the local supervisor thinks, yes, I think this person is now ready to undertake that. So there's a number of checks and balances that we need to see before that happens. It's not, I'm not opening the door.
No,
and saying
the principle
every
is
PA should now
already
prescribe.
established.
Yeah, the principle's already established. Thank you. That's an excellent way of putting it. The principle's already established, and there shouldn't be an absolute bar on PAs prescribing ever.
Yeah. Whereas with ionizing radiation,
the risks are higher, and therefore I have not recommended that that's part of their portfolio.
Okay. In terms of the narrative, the kind of history of this, I think your report does a really fascinating job of describing that, the evolution of physician associates. And the way I read it is that the whole kind of push to recruit physician associates or assistants, as they were then called, was really triggered by Jeremy Hunt in 2015, around the time of the name change.
Well, they were originally introduced into the NHS in the early 2000s. That's when they first took up roles here, largely at that point with PAs that had been trained in the United States. So we picked up people that in the US were largely military trained, took up roles, came over here. I think we originally had a pilot in Scotland of the PA role, but the numbers were small. And yes, you mentioned Jeremy Hunt around about 2015, around the time of the name change, and an expansion in the number of roles at that point. And of course, we then saw a desire to have even more PAs in the workforce plan in 2023.
And we'll come to the plan in a moment. When you look at the data, the number of physician assistants, as they're now called, in that period, 2015 to now, went up by about 2,000, whereas the number of anaesthetic associates went up by about 100. But there's quite an outcry. I mean, I'm not saying that the issues don't apply, but considering it's a relatively small number, how do you explain that?
The relatively small number of anaesthesia associates is interesting, and they're concentrated, though, in particular areas where there were gaps in consultant anaesthetists. And the role of AA was welcomed largely by the College of Anaesthetists when it was first introduced, because there was an expectation that we would not have enough anaesthetists, anaesthetists, doctors. And therefore, this would be a way forward, because around the world there are quite a number of non-physician anaesthetists, usually nurse trained rather than the model that we have here. However, we are now in a position where it looks as though there will be sufficient doctors coming through as anaesthetists, and we probably don't need as many AAs or PAAs in the future as we once thought. So that's why the report recommends that there is a re-evaluation of the workforce numbers in conjunction with the College of Anaesthetists before we invest further.
Okay, but I did wonder whether actually the role that those AAs, as they're now known, the role that they were taking on was much more displacing anaesthetists than other PAs were doing. So I know there's a fear that sort of happened to a degree in general practice as well, but I wonder if that's what caused the outrage.
I don't think there was much displacement, more in terms of the feedback and the comments that I've received. It's been more about filling gaps, and that equally applied to PAs in primary care. We see a concentration in anaesthesia and in primary care where there were gaps and where we couldn't find doctors.
Okay, I mean, one argument, apart from the sort of the numbers game, we need to have, we haven't got enough staff. We can't. Doctors are expensive. It's cheaper to hire physician assistants. That obviously is, your expertise in cost effectiveness. cost is not cost effectiveness. You save money, it doesn't mean it's cost effective. What did you find any data on that, and were you able to comment on that with any confidence?
We didn't find much data. We looked, but we didn't find much data.
Yeah.
Some studies have attempted to do something described as cost-effective analysis, but it was more a case of saying, if we have this member of staff, their salary is lower, therefore it's more cost-effective than that member of staff who is more expensive, and that's really rather too simplistic.
Yeah. Because the premise there is that the outcomes are equivalent. Which you can't assume that at all.
No. To do a proper cost-effective analysis, you need really good data.
Yeah.
You need to be really clear about what the effectiveness is and how it compares. And ideally, you'd want to compare a team of people with a PA or an AA, as we've been looking, versus a team without them. Don't have that data. As I said earlier, we don't have good effectiveness data. So it was quite a challenge to look at that. It would be great if we'd had better data, but we haven't.
Yeah. So we've got a scenario of, a workforce, an element of the workforce where the cost effectiveness is unproved, where there's very limited data around safety and effectiveness. Yet it's expanded rapidly and further accelerated by the most recent workforce plan, which has many critics and reasons to question it. This sounds like a monumental failure of workforce planning.
Workforce planning is complex. I haven't looked at workforce planning in detail. I have looked at implementation of the roles because I was specifically asked to in the remit to look at whether there were any lessons to be learned from how we rolled these roles out at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think there are some things we could learn about that. I haven't looked at workforce planning and what was right and what wasn't. But in terms of rollout, what's ideally you should have is a clear vision for how these roles were going to work in practice.
And that didn't exist.
That didn't exist. And I have specifically asked, where was the vision? How were the roles going to fit in?
Yeah.
And I think if we'd had that, we'd have had less of this substitution, because people would have known, well, actually, now we've got to reconfigure the team to look like this. We didn't have the vision. You need good leadership, good communication, particularly around something sensitive like this new role working alongside doctors. And the other thing you need is good local support for the workforce, good local implementation.
Yeah.
And I suspect, because this is where I've seen many examples of this, it was about filling in the gaps, and we were not perhaps as sophisticated as we might have been about how these roles were introduced.
Yeah, without knowing whether they're cost effective or whether there's patients would be safe either. So was one option here to halt recruitment of PAs?
Sorry, I must just say, because it struck me that there has been this intensive review of this group of staff.
Yeah.
And I don't think any group of staff, either in the NHS or beyond, has ever been subject to this degree of scrutiny.
No, fair enough.
It's worth reflecting on that, and it hasn't been an easy time for them as we've gone through this.
Well, actually, I did want to ask you about that because, as you say, doctors that work with PAs, and I've spoken to a number of them, are very positive about that experience. I went to a general practice where PAs are very much involved in delivering care, and the practice runs well. The doctors running the practice are very happy with how their practice runs, and others say the same thing, and your data support that as well. There's a danger this comes across as being very negative for physician assistants.
Yeah. And they are well liked by the doctors that have them in their teams. And in particular, I would say they provide consistency. They provide members of staff that senior doctors can work with and can invest in. And I was struck going through this review about the difference in training of PAs compared with our resident doctors who move around such a lot. They have transitory roles, whereas PAs can provide the glue. They can provide that consistency. The patients know them, the staff know them on the wards, and they don't have to move around. And in fact, some PAs said, "Look, I never wanted to be a doctor. I didn't want to be so disrupted in my personal life. I didn't want to have that uncertainty about my training."
Yeah.
And we should learn a little bit of that in relation to the training of doctors.
Yeah. Okay. Can we get back to? I think you're right to reflect those concerns in terms of recruitment. However, was there a case to be made for halting recruitment at this point, given the data, given the concerns you've heard, given the lack of vision, and clearly, I mean, not enough thinking through the whole expansion of PAs?
I did consider in going through the process whether we should either stop recruitment or halt permanently these roles. However, there wasn't sufficient evidence to say that we should do that. We need more staff in the NHS. These are people who are well-trained, committed members of the workforce. But what we do need to do is to have that clarity around how they work and make sure the roles are effective alongside doctors.
Yeah. So one of the issues, of course, is that primary care, general practice, it's in a bit of the staffing is a mess. And there are certain areas, even though there are unemployed doctors now, it seems strange that there are practices that can't recruit doctors. And physician associates, now to be called assistants, have been used to fill in those particular those sort of general practices. But my reading of what you're saying here is that would not be appropriate in general practice, and those workforce issues would have to be resolved by other means.
I think there are lots of roles that PAs can fulfil in primary care. And reading the government's new 10-year health plan, when they talk about neighbourhood plans, they talk about the need for prevention, there are many things that PAs can assist with. What we should avoid is a role that was designed for a doctor being substituted by a PA. They should be doing the lower risk elements of that. We talked earlier about seeing adult patients with minor ailments. They can do follow-up. There's plenty of things that they can do in primary care, but not just substituting.
Okay. And then in terms of role, you also talk about the role PAs have in mental health. And I think you describe it as often they're doing, having done psychiatry for a while, as a resident junior doctor, you're often doing the physical side of things, physical examination, history-taking examination. That's the kind of role that I think you describe PAs fulfilling in mental health. But you point out that obviously people tend to have rather complex medical needs.
They do. And you're right. Most of the PAs currently working in the mental health service are doing those physical health checks. And I think they might have been recommended in NICE guidelines that you should have an annual health check.
When you were chief exec?
Possibly. It's good to have those roles filled.
Yeah.
What PAs don't have is much experience and training in mental health symptomatology. It's more the physical side. So I think there is work to be done to develop how they should be employed in the mental health service to make sure that there's support for them, but certainly that they provide a useful role in mental health.
But are you also? I thought you were saying that there's a risk there as well, because often people's sort of physical health needs are pretty complex as well.
They are.
Yeah,
they are.
They're not straightforward.
They're not straightforward, and there often isn't someone that named doctor for the PA who's done the physical health check to go to say, look, I found this.
Yeah.
So that's where the service development, where the recommendation around a named doctor is in place, so that there is further support for the PA in doing those health checks.
Okay. Can I ask you, you mentioned the NHS plan. And the plan does talk about, I think with some element of controversy around it, about how AI technology and also a different mix in the workforce is going to allow us to meet our future healthcare needs and demands on the health service. Do you see your report, your review, informing that, I guess?
I think my report will inform, I hope it will, inform the workforce planning. That will be a plan being published, I think, in the autumn. So that's where I would like it to go. But I think that mixture that you described of AI, technology, that's going to continue to change the way the health service works and the roles that all professionals do. So I don't think workforce planning is going to be straightforward.
No.
Because it's going to be changing so rapidly.
Yeah, because I was wondering whether they've made it more complicated. I know what West Streeting said about this, but the fact that I mean, when people, because the plan arrived before your review arrived, and I think the kind of assumption was, well, there's going to be an expansion of the PA role. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you can't you can't fulfill what the plan is promising. But your review is limiting that role or making it much better defined.
Yeah.
And hence, it's not what I think people assumed when they read the plan.
I don't know what they assumed when they read the plan. However, I think there's plenty. I think there's plenty that the PA role can do in the context of the 10-year health plan. Yeah. Absolutely. That we need staff. These are flexible staff. They can be trained in many different ways. We've got the new neighbourhood health centres, if I've given them the correct name, where we need to have staff that are prepared to pick up new roles that relate to prevention. And that was some very positive feedback that we had from both patients and clinicians, doctors, about the role of PAs in prevention. So I think I'm not concerned about that. If I were a workforce planner, I'd be more concerned about the AI and the tech side of it. And I think that the PAs will provide a really useful contribution.
Okay. Jill, I'm going to read you the final paragraph. You probably know this without me having to read it to you, of the introduction to your review. Very thorough review it is too. The recommendations therefore represent a pragmatic solution that aims to bring cohesion and clarity. They won't be universally popular, but we must now close the debate and move forward constructively, focusing on excellent teamwork and delivering world-leading patient care. Do you think you've lanced the boil with this?
I hope so. But this report is not the end of the story. It now needs to be the beginning of a new chapter, and we need effective collaboration to move it forwards. We need further work to get those teams right. That vision that I said we didn't have at the beginning, let's have a constructive collaboration around what that looks like moving forwards. But I do hope that the boil is indeed lanced so we can do that constructive move forward.
Finally, I mean, you were given an impossible task. I mean, you couldn't please everybody with this review. No. You were going to upset one group of professionals or another group, or upset them both to some degree with what you produce. How do you feel about it?
Well, I was clear at the beginning that this was a challenging task, and therefore the best I could do was to be as thorough as I could and to talk to as many people about the approach I was taking all the way through. And I think I've done that. And I think the outcome is logical, sensible and pragmatic. And I hope that people will accept the report and move forwards, because it has been a really difficult time for all concerned. The NHS needs an effective workforce. So not everyone will be pleased, but let's move forwards. Let's collaborate.
Gillian Leng, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kamran.